for joining me today. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen because I have a small presentation. So again, I'm just going to restate the topic that I'm going to talk about today is my first book that came out in 2019, Rethinking Ownership of Development in Africa. And the book was originally my dissertation project and for work I had done beginning in about 2012. So I want to start with just a quick kind of anecdote that I think will help anchor the book and provide some context to the conversation today. So when I was doing field work for the project in Kenya in 2015, one of the things I had noticed, especially within the literature and when I was on the ground, was that there was this constant refrain that ownership meant governments being in the driver's seat, right? Over and over, governments are in the driver's seat. And one particular day, I was waiting for an interview with a civil servant at the Treasury in Kenya. And when the person arrived for the interview, we went into their office and I sat down and noticed there was this inconspicuous piece of paper hanging on the wall. And the paper said, donors want governments in the driver's seat, but donors want to hold on to the roadmap. I took this phrase and I thought that it was a perfect encapsulation of what I was finding ownership to actually kind of be a reference to when in fact it's being applied in different African contexts. And so just to give you a little bit of background about what I mean by ownership of development, the project really started with an interest I had in the various explanations that development practitioners and development scholars were coming up with for why there was this ostensible underdevelopment in Africa, or why African countries were quote unquote slow to develop. And beyond the traditional kind of structural explanations like modernization theory and dependency theory, a lot of the contemporary literature really focused on these more nuanced explanations. And ownership was a ubiquitous answer across a lot of this literature, right? Is that African governments are not taking ownership of their own development. Now, the dominant discourse suggests that ownership is rooted in the Paris Declaration from 2005. And that definition of ownership suggests that it's developing countries setting their own strategies for poverty reduction and improving institutions to tackle corruption. But what I argue in the book is that we should think of ownership as less about just a concept, but actually a paradigm, a different type of development paradigm that's really rooted in the World Bank and the IMF's quest to re-legitimize themselves in the aftermath of failed structural adjustment policies. So long before the OECD's Paris Declaration in 2005, the World Bank and the IMF had proposed what they called the Comprehensive Development Framework. And the Comprehensive Development Framework was a direct response to growing insurrections and protests because of the aftermath of formal structural adjustment policies. So even the US in the late 1990s considered basically taking back money and defunding aspects of the World Bank because there was concern about the legitimacy and the need to have an institution like the World Bank if it wasn't able to actually bring about development, and if there were all of these mounting protests against the policies that the World Bank and the IMF were pushing under structural adjustments. And so the World Bank and the IMF instead came up with this framework that reimagined just essentially the rhetoric of development to be about, one, moving away from a donor recipient kind of language towards partnership, and moving away from these short-term development strategies to long-term development strategies, so like poverty reduction strategy papers, but also, which was key to the CDF and subsequently became key to the OECD's high-level fora, is this notion of ownership, is that governments actually need to take responsibility for their own development. And so in the book, I'm arguing that it's important to think about ownership outside of just a question about governments being in control of their development, but in this particular format where it's about donors keeping the same types of practices, but reconfiguring the rhetoric around partnership and shared responsibility without actually taking any of that responsibility themselves. So I designed the project to examine essentially how does ownership function in these two different African contexts, right? So if as donors were and development practitioners were proposing is that ownership is about country context, country-led development, et cetera, well then what we should see is that in two different African countries is that they have development strategies and development tools that are particular to their own unique context and their own unique development challenges. And so I chose Burkina Faso and Kenya to account for a variety of difference in context. So to account for different colonial histories, different political and economic situations, whereby Burkina Faso is economically not as developed or as powerful as Kenya, but was relatively more politically stable when I first started the project. Now, while I was doing the project, in fact, the revolution took place in Burkina, where Blaise Compaoré was actually ousted. And we can talk about that in the formal or informal Q&A. But Burkina Faso, which was more relatively stable compared to Kenya, which was politically unstable, but an economic powerhouse, right? And obviously accounting for the different Francophone and Anglophone colonial contexts. Across both countries, I had 75 interviews with different government officials, civil society members, and donors. I conducted participant observations and then triangulated all of these interviews, participant observations with policies, international policies from the different donors, as well as the national and sector-wide development strategies from both countries. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about three of the key findings that I engage in the book, and then I'll go over how these different findings have manifested in each country. So the first thing I want to talk about, which I alluded to a little bit in the beginning, is how the ownership paradigm really kind of transfers accountability from donors to the different Burkinabe and Kenyan stakeholders, right? And reformulates the issue or the source of underdevelopment or slow development within different African countries as being internal to those countries, right? So it effectively shifts the locus of responsibility and accountability, especially away from like the formulations of the international economic order, right? To these kind of internal problems by effectively saying that the governments are not taking ownership or they're not in control of their own development strategies. But also, again, suggesting that donors themselves offer nothing or have no contribution to whatever those policies or whatever the pejorative consequences of those policies are. Another thing that I found, which was very striking to me, was that under this context or under this paradigm, Burkinabe and Kenyan stakeholders consistently refer to themselves as being underdeveloped, right? So they started from this position of believing that their location within the development frame, within the development paradigm is as underdeveloped, right? And that they in fact do need donors through their financial expertise and their financial assistance and epistemic assistance, which I talk about as another finding, in order to actually become developed. So I'll read just one or two of these quotes just in case someone doesn't have access to the screen, right? So one of the officials from the interviews in Nairobi stated, "Government ideally should lead agenda setting, but there are limitations with resources and technical expertise." And then from Burkina, one of the officials from the Ministry of Finance stated, "Burkina is an underdeveloped country, so when one speaks of development, it's to be totally independent. Actually, we depend a lot on outside aid," right? And so these kinds of references to not being developed and depending on donors and expertise was very pervasive across both countries, in fact. And this relates to one of the other findings, which is that ownership actually increases the need, or the ostensible need, for countries to rely on donors as providing financial assistance and what I call epistemic assistance, right? Whereby donors construct themselves as having a wealth of technical knowledge and technical expertise that exists beyond the purview or access for the countries themselves or the governments themselves, and can only be had through donor assistance. So in Burkina Faso, I want to talk about this in one particular context with respect to the family planning and economic growth policy, right? So, but this is also at the community-based level. So one of the things I did while I was in Burkina Faso was spend a lot of time with community-based organizations, especially in the Tinkotogo region. And the community-based organizations were different associations with members from the community that worked around health and implementing different health projects for the community. But a lot of these community-based organizations receive funding from NGOs, who in turn receive their funding from donors, multilateral and bilateral, and the government. The funding was to implement the national strategy, which was Burkina's poverty reduction strategy papers, and essentially got funneled down through the NGOs to these community-based organizations who were effectively implementing these different strategies. While I was in Tinkotogo and I was talking to a number of different members from these health associations and observing the meetings with the different NGOs, it's funny, I wasn't asking specifically about family planning at this time, or was necessarily interested in, questions around maternal health, et cetera. I was really interested in how they're navigating ownership, right? But what kept coming up in the interviews, especially with the community-based organizations, was this notion that the country was underdeveloped, and a lot of that underdevelopment was tied to women having too many children, and them having too many children being a consequence of their inability to let go of these traditional notions of family and family planning. And so one director, for example, from that was the head of one of these community-based organizations, said, and I'll just read the quote, in reference to the Millennium Development Goals, this was pre-Sustainable Development Goals when I was doing this work, that Burkina did not reach the MDGs because even today there are maternal deaths. In Tinkotogo, there have been more than 20 maternal deaths in 2014, 1 woman, 9 children. It's too much, right? And so this was a pervasive kind of reference, right, across the community-based organizations, where they kept describing Burkina as underdeveloped and then linking that underdevelopment, one, back to women and people in communities' inability to kind of let go of tradition, but also into the government, right? Linking that back to the government and a presumed lack of government investment in getting maternal mortality rates down and controlling or effectively developing the population. The other element that I want to talk about from the community-based organizations, and I mentioned this again, is that they receive funding from the NGOs. And a lot of the community-based organizations brought up their discontent with how their programming is necessarily structured around what donors and the government officials want, right? So they receive funding to implement the different projects that the donors and the governments have outlined as a part of the national strategy. And so the community-based organizations, although they're called community-based, end up being held accountable to the donors and less to the communities. So the projects that they implement have little to do with what the community decides that it needs. And we can understand that, especially if we look at, for example, family planning. If there's a low demand for modern contraception, and the communities are actually responding to that need, right, or to the other needs that the community identifies, then the model looks a lot different. Versus what in fact was happening was that there was a huge push to increase the number of women using contraception and using the community-based organizations to do that work. And so a lot of the organizations, although some of them were disgruntled with this, talked about how they could not be in existence if it were not for the NGOs and not for the donor funding. And again, kind of going back to one of the key findings, right, is that the framework essentially places responsibility for Burkina's underdevelopment, not just back on the government, but also on women. So across all of the interviews that I conducted, I would ask, so who is responsible when development policies fail? The resounding answer was the government. Again, this is despite the heavy emphasis and influence that donors have in both shaping the development policies in Burkina Faso and also funding those policies, even down to the community level. Looking at how this unfolds in Kenya is also a very intriguing case. So here I'm going to talk about this at the level of government and the donor-government relations and the way that this manifests in Kenya. So Kenya is an interesting case study because they had a contentious relationship with donors ever since the late 1970s, early 1980s. So there was a point at which, especially during structural adjustments, when Kenya consistently lost donor funding because donors felt like the government was too corrupt or that they weren't actually implementing the policies in the way that donors felt would be the most successful. And so once Kenya got on board with the ownership strategy, right? So they produced a poverty reduction strategy paper, they adopted medium-term expenditure frameworks, all of the tools that accompany the paradigm. The donors re-implemented a lot of their aid, a lot of the aid and the loans to Kenya. Now, the way that this manifests here, I thought was particularly striking that there was this gross mistrust between donors and the Kenyan government because donors felt like they could not trust the Kenyan government to actually implement any of the policies that they had collaborated on with the donors. On the reverse, the Kenyan government felt like the language of ownership gave them leverage to essentially use to create some space for agency with respect to donors, right? So I would hear Kenyan government officials say to me constantly, like, donors can't tell us what to do anymore because we have ownership, and ownership allows us to dictate our own policies. Again, remember, we're in the driver's seat. But what ended up happening, though, was in the wake of this ownership kind of coming into place, especially in Kenya, was that there were still issues around what the donors would call governance, right? And lack of trust for the Kenyan government. And the government, in turn, was essentially trying to prove to donors that they were, in fact, trustworthy and that they could be in control of their own development strategies. Similar to the Burkina situation, a lot of the donors and the NGO civil society members that I spoke with who were responsible for helping to carry out government policies constantly referenced how donors were essential to all of the policies that were taking place in Kenya, right? Without donors, different development actors, especially at the local level, would say that the government would collapse, right? Kenya would collapse if donors were to decide that they wanted to move on from Kenya, or if they took away their funding again. Even though there was this financial and epistemic influence that donors wielded over the various development policies, down to constructing what a PRSP was and how it would be implemented, all of those things the Kenyan government did to even reinstate donor funding across the board from the various stakeholders that I interviewed, everyone said that if and when development policies in Kenya fail, that it is the government's responsibility. So donors have no responsibility or are not held accountable if and when different policies, development policies do in fact fail. Just in the interest of times. So I just want to kind of summarize this and think about the broader implications for ownership, right? If we go back to that story that I used at the beginning and thinking about this notion that donors want governments in the driver's seat, but they want to hold on to the roadmap. If we conceive of the roadmap as the different development strategies that African countries can take depending on their own unique context and their own kind of development challenges, well, then it doesn't make sense that anything called ownership should be a matter of governments using these particular tools and these different discourses, having this external influence, but then those external influencers are not also held accountable for what the outcomes of those policies are, right? One of the other things I talk about, especially in the conclusion of the book, is this kind of trend across the language of ownership that that focus on this kind of forward-facing approach to development, right? This notion that we don't have to look to the past, as one of the former World Bank presidents said about the CDF and moving forward with ownership. It's let us not look to the past, right? Those things don't necessarily serve us anymore. Let's just keep looking to the future. Development is about the future, right? And there's this kind of teleological understanding of development that very much maps onto a modernization or a kind of liberal modernity in the way that that development is supposed to manifest. And I argue, especially in the conclusion, is that what we instead can think about is what it means to return to the past, right? This kind of Sankofa model, returning to the past, not necessarily in some nostalgic sense, but using the past to reformulate and recreate alternatives and alternative notions of what development means, but especially thinking about how we got to the place that we've arrived at today, right? And we can't do that work if we're only looking forward without thinking about how the actors, right, donors themselves, have been heavily implicated in all of the different varieties and stages of underdevelopment that African countries have found themselves in, especially since the era of and especially in the post-independence phase, right? So with that, I will stop talking and open it up for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Makoni, over to you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I have a couple of questions or issues that I would like to discuss with you. What does ownership mean, for example? Do men in the African countries that you studied have a different understanding of ownership from women? And what are the implications of that for theoretical framing?
Yeah, so when I did the project, I wasn't looking across genders to see if there was a difference there, because at first I was really more interested in how all of the actors in general were thinking about it, because they had in general had been left out of the discussion on ownership, right? So a lot of the dominant literature just looked at what governments thought and not thought about what people on the ground were saying. But I will say there was a difference, and I talk about this in the book, in terms of across the country. So for example, in Burkina, I argue that the local kind of notion, the Burkinabe notion of development, has its roots in the Sankara model, or what I call this kind of Sankara notion of development, where it's a matter of collectively people coming together and everyone having a role to play and understanding their collective role in bringing about progress and change.
Okay. You say somewhere, I think in one of your articles, that ownership was never meant to grapple with historical inequities that have framed the ways in which the African continent was brought into the global economic system. So if I follow this, for you, it's not a question of increasing ownership as a way of trying to reverse social inequalities in Africa. Is that the logical conclusion to take? Because here you are saying that ownership was never meant to grapple with historical inequities. So there are two questions here. So what strategies can you adopt to try and grapple with historical inequities? Because ownership, according to this paragraph, was never meant to grapple with historical inequities.
Yeah. So I think this comes down to what a lot of African leaders had previously been proposing, especially prior to NAPAD, the New Economic Partnership for African Development. Prior to that, there was a way in which African thinkers, leaders, scholars, et cetera, were pointing to the structural issues that came from the international economic order, right? So you had the NIEO, you had Kwame Nkrumah's neocolonialism, you have Julius Nyerere, Sankara, all of these people who were talking about there's an inability to, for even if we want to adopt this modern notion of development, right, of economic development, that African countries have been locked into this structural location whereby they can only provide their natural resources, right? They're brought into the system as providing natural resources, but that, and because of that, they can't effectively industrialize, they can't effectively lead whatever kind of development strategy that they would like to lead is because of what Kwame Nkrumah refers to, right, is like these neo-colonial relationships, right? Mm-hmm. So there's a way in which within dominant development literature, all of that is absent, right? People are only talking about governance and corruption and needing to stabilize macroeconomic structures, right? But they're not talking about these neo-colonial relationships, right? Or these post-colonial relationships that really inform the types of strategies that governments are taking, what they can and cannot take, or can and cannot adopt, if you will.
Okay, I want to raise one or two more questions, then I'll give over to Magda. In your paper that is entitled "When There is Nothing Left to Own, Materiality and Security in Africa," you begin, over the past 20 years, Africa has been marked by unprecedented economic growth and an influx of social movements. What I want to highlight there is the issue about social movements. Then later on, I think 10 lines into your paper, you say this: though desperate in form, many of these social movements aim to disrupt savage developmentalism. What is a social movement?
Yeah, so I think of social movements in two different forms, right? So there are those that are more contrived in a group of people that are coming together for a collective purpose against some kind of power structure, right? But then I also think of social movements as those that don't necessarily have to be as contrived and as collective, but individuals either together or by themselves, finding ways to challenge dominant power structures, right? And find ways to create either alternative systems, alternative outcomes for themselves, for their communities, right? And sometimes that might just look like groups or individuals exercising their agency, again, in ways that go against the kind of the dominant structures, right? Or the dominant narratives.
Okay. All right. Let me then just raise the last question, then I can give over to somebody else. When I was reading your work, what kept coming into my mind were the arguments that Thabo Mbeki was making in terms of African Renaissance, when in that famous speech of his, "I'm an African," and then later on in the speech in which he talks about the two nations. So I wanted to ask you to help me think this through. if you were to buy into the arguments of African Renaissance, as articulated by Thabo Mbeki and other African leaders, what would be the implications of that framework for what you call savage developmentalism?
So if I were to buy into it, so I guess clearly, I don't, right?
Okay, well, it doesn't matter what percent you want to take. What I'm trying to work out was, I was just trying to think through, Thabo Mbeki is talking about African Renaissance. So it means to some extent, he thinks that there is hope for being able to redress these global inequalities. So I'm trying to see how these discourses can be, whether you can connect them or they're so different. I mean, the discourses of developmentalism and the discourses of African Renaissance.
Yeah.
Because, yeah.
So there are scholars, for example, like Zine Magubeni, right, and others who've been very critical of the African Renaissance, especially that which Thabo Mbeki proposed. And there was Abdoulaye Wade, Olusegun Obasanjo, right, from Nigeria, who were all a part of this African Renaissance movement. But a lot of the critique has been about the language and the rhetoric, because this is all evident in NAPAD, came out at the same time as this ownership paradigm, right? Where there was this move towards neoliberalism being accepted in Africa as the appropriate strategy for economic growth on the continent. And if you contrast this, especially with the Lagos plan that was proposed previously, right? Where the Lagos plan identified how it was not just a matter of corruption and governance, but again, influence from Western powers that very much shaped the political and economic conditions across the continent. Well, you see how the Lagos plan actually looks like what they were trying to put forward was this kind of renaissance where they're proposing, how do you break the various chains that are basically confining the continent? The African Renaissance and what's embedded in NAPAD is essentially an adoption of a lot of the rhetoric that was coming from the World Bank and the IMF. And again, you can look at, there are scholars who actually critique this directly and talking about the limitations of NAPAD as not being uniquely African, if that, as a strategy, but really just jumping on board with that which was proposed already, especially through the OECD high-level forums and through the international reorganization of the aid architecture, right, in the early 2000s. So my own sentiments in having read those criticisms and looked at some of the work from NAPAD as well, because NAPAD also adopts poverty reduction strategy papers. NAPAD adopts sector-wide approaches, right? It adopts a lot of that same kind of language, and it's very clear, and it's also, what's conspicuously absent is a reference to the role that donors and international actors are playing and shaping the continent, right? There's also work from scholars like the Women Collective who show how the policies, especially in South Africa, that have been implemented are very much around natural resource excavation, which leads to a further dispossession, right, of land from indigenous communities, right, that sit on the reserves for these natural resources, and that the government has been behind them because these types of strategies are what's been propelling the economic growth across the continent, right? So Ian Taylor talks about this, especially in his 2016 article, Dependency Redux, where he's saying how a lot of African countries are still in the same location that they were during colonialism and in the aftermath in terms of reliance on natural resources, which is a highly volatile international market, right? And so that strategy is very particular to what NAPAD and what the African Renaissance is proposing in order to develop the continent, right? Not at all different from what the World Bank and the IMF are suggesting.
Okay, right. Then this is the last question. You don't have to answer it, because I think we can come back to it. The question then, which was going through my mind as I read your work, I kept asking myself, how does this situation look like now because of the engagement of the Chinese in the African developmental debates? Right. Your work, rightly, I mean, you were focusing on Western donors, but now you have the Chinese. So I was just sort of trying to work through in my own mind, what does ownership mean for the Chinese when they are in Africa? What does development mean? We can talk about that in the informal section. So let me hand over to Magda, otherwise I'll be talking too much.
Thank you, Dr. Makoni. Actually, the first question that I have on the chat box is kind of related to your question. So unfortunately, my colleague Basi has very unstable internet connection in his home city. So if he's back, he will be joining me in the moderation of this part. Meanwhile, Teboho, our friend Teboho, makes a comment and a question. So he says, ownership of African development would ideally be part of the major problem of poor progress of Africa. But history of unequal exchange connection to exploitative Euro-America, Russia, and now China, together with knowledge economy, puts Africa behind. These competitors are always running ahead of Africa and setting exploitation traps, and Africa running behind its competitors, exploiters, to set traps of its exploitation. So the question is, could you speak to the alternatives for Africa to overcome historical roles?
Yes, thank you for that question. So what I imagine is, especially in thinking about these different countries, right? So I'm very much partial to the notion that each country, although there are these kind of global inequities, right, and regional inequities that the various sub-Saharan African countries experience collectively, but when it comes down to national development strategies, is that it's extremely important to take into consideration the different contexts for each country, right? Because each country has its own unique challenges. And so I'll just speak a little bit about what this looks like in Burkina, if I can. And I talk a little bit about this in the book around the Thomas Sankara model, right? Where Thomas Sankara was implementing a development strategy, although he was only in power for a very short time, from about 1983 to 1987. Sankara implemented, and it's a really good example of what it looks like to implement austerity measures, but in a humane and country-specific context, right? So while Sankara was in office, he did actually implement austerity measures where there were gross cuts in social services or gross cuts in government positions and restraints on the market, et cetera. But Sankara's model was that everyone should have to share in the cut, right? So everyone should have to, the burden of responsibility should be equally distributed across the Burkinabe society, and everyone has a role to play in cutting back so that they could get through the challenges, the economic challenges that the country would have to overcome in order to get past that particularly challenging moment. And so what Sankara was doing as well was also focusing on what he called, he suggested that colonialism was not just about these kind of foreign actors, that like foreign boogeymen that existed outside, but even said, like, imperialism, if you want to see imperialism, look on your plate, right? The rice you're eating on your plate is a sign of imperialism because that rice was imported from elsewhere. And because the notion that that rice being imported from elsewhere is of a better quality than all the rice that Burkina is producing here, right, is another manifestation of imperialism. And so Sankara was really trying to implement a model that was also about getting over what Wangari Maathai calls this kind of cultural nihilism, right? This notion that whatever was produced within Burkina Faso was of a lesser quality than that which would be imported as a finished good from the Western countries, right? So I think to answer your question, one of the alternatives have to be located or have to be rooted in the different contexts, but also have to grapple with the ways in which colonialism was not just a purely economic system, right? But it was political and it was cultural as well. And so the vestiges kind of colonialism, or neo-colonialism, if we think about Nkrumah, really manifest themselves in various ways. So you can't really get over the, as you're talking about, what the person offering the question is talking about, right, is these traps that are being set by international actors that are kind of keeping these countries in perpetually locked position, underdeveloped positions, without considering all of the ways in which these things are really kind of tied and rooted to all of them being reliant on these kind of international trade systems and these kind of ligatures of colonialism, if that makes sense.
Thank you very much for your answer, Dr. Harper Shipman. We have also a comment and a question from our colleague Attila. Attila is mentioning that neoliberal public policies and, for example, a road of 1,000 miles in the Amazon for the economic growth, without considering what you say as non-material facets of development. So his question is, could you speak more about endogenous development to respect our cultures and help food security and nutrition to our people who do not belong to capitalist intentions?
Yes, thank you. This is such a really great question. So I'll reference again the Women Collective, right, that do work at the intersection of women and development, indigeneity in Africa, and especially the southern region of Africa. And part of what they argue is that a lot of what's taking place, especially in what they call this kind of like extractive model of development, right, is that the dominant notions we see that are coming from the World Bank, coming from governments, the African governments themselves, which of course are complicit, is that there's this reliance on natural resources. But to get to those natural resources, it requires displacement of indigenous communities, right? So again, this kind of accumulation through dispossession that's recurring over and over. And so they're arguing that there's also a unique way in which women are still kind of tied to the land, right? And women kind of carry the culture and and also become the root for proposing alternatives to development at different places, right? Like within these communities, and acting as, I guess, the source for a lot of these social movements, right, that I'm talking about, because so much of, because they understand and so much of their own existence is tied to the land, right? And I want to also make mention of, you know, this notion about the feminization of poverty, right? That has constantly come through globalization and through this kind of extractive development, right? So I do want to do that in terms of talking about how women are proposing these different types of alternatives, right, through their indigeneity to development, especially in the southern region of Africa. I'll give an example from Cameroon. The Bokso women produced in Cameroon using this traditional farming technique called the Yume. And the Yume was and while this community in Cameroon was dealing with high rates of food insecurity, they relied on a traditional technique called the Yume that allowed women to get together and exchange in farming. So the technique, and I'm not all the way well versed on how the technique worked specifically, but the women got together and collectively farmed each other's land using this traditional technique. And through this, they were able to actually like reverse the food insecurity in the community. Now, of course, development practitioners got a hold of this and they turned it into like, how do we, you know, bring to scale the Yume technique? It's, you know, as is their want to do. So I think that's one other example, right, of kind of returning to traditional agricultural techniques that had always been there, but were lost in the process towards letting go of those traditional things and moving towards, modern development modern instruments, right, towards agricultural production. Another example, which I give in the book as well, from Burkina Faso, was, and it's a really, if any of you are interested in watching the film, it's called The Man Who Stopped the Desert. And it follows a man by the name of Yakub Sawadago in northern Burkina Faso, who again relied on a traditional agricultural technique that had been lost, that was considered antiquated, and relied on this technique to actually reverse and stop desertification that was taking place in northern Burkina Faso. Something that World Bank and other development agencies had tried to do, right? How do we stop the desert from constantly encroaching, but we're not able to do. So to answer that question, I think there's just these three kind of really important examples of communities relying on indigenous knowledge and alternative knowledges in order to address a lot of the issues that have come about because of modern development, if you will.
Thank you. Attila, you added some comments about the corruption of the international agencies and very little found being destinated to schools, health, environmental protection. Maybe you would like to speak about the context that you're familiar with in Brazil.
Thank you very much. Just one comment. In 1979 and 80, the World Bank came to the Amazon, and I worked in the National Research Council, and they did a partnership with the military government. I had to leave the government because of political dictatorship pressures. And people were killed, my friends, Surui native people, destruction of thousands and today millions of hectares being burned, destroyed, forests. And the conception of the government, military, was the national plan of development, like in Africa, must follow Washington consensus, must produce capitalist commodities, and we don't have our possibilities. And corruption in the local government and in the federal government, as the dictatorship could, put like some kind of a way not to let people know like in democratic systems, the corruption. But the main corruption is mind monoculture. So I just want to comment that I like it very much, the two articles you sent us and the book that I will read. And I think we can really compare situations as the World Bank and others are, showing us we must have to struggle locally, political fight to have our own development and preserve our culture.
Yes. Thank you, Attila. I also want to add to that, because you're absolutely right, is that we all remember Margaret Thatcher saying, Tina, right? There is no alternative. And a lot of what we're seeing on the ground, though, and what I'm talking about in that article around social movements, is that people have come to completely reject that, right? And have been rejecting that and saying there are, not only are there alternatives, but there must be alternatives, right? The current model is not sustainable by any means necessary. And so to say that there are no alternatives is to commit everybody to a certain death, right? And people are fighting convincingly against that model and saying there must be, not only are there alternatives, but again, there must be alternatives.
Thank you. I will continue with two philosophical questions, one from Desmond and the other one from Freddie. Desmond is asking to explain your understanding of development, and the question is, does Africa need this development? And Freddie is asking about in whose interest it is to have Africa remain in underdevelopment.
Mm-hmm. Okay, the first one is really tricky. Not because I'm like a post-structuralist or anything or the postmodernist, but it's really tricky because I think sometimes it does fall back into the trap of trying to propose solutions that are not really rooted in the problems that communities see for themselves, right? And so for me, development is something that's always been taking place, right? Humanity is a matter, humanity has come to the place where it has been, right, because of development, and not capitalist savage development, right? But essentially people identifying problems within their communities and finding solutions to those problems, right? So that to me is development. When we have a system that tells people a priori what those problems are, right, and identifies the problems for those communities, and then makes it so that the solutions, they themselves are situated squarely as controlling those solutions as well, well, I think then that's actually anti-development, right? And so sometimes I'm reluctant to give the World Bank and donors the credit of saying what they do is development, right? Because in fact, it's what communities have been doing, right? They do development. Donors in the international community, et cetera, are actually doing anti-development, right? In my opinion. The question around whose interest is it? So I think we can always, I think Fanon offers a lot, right, in terms of answering this question very early on, right, where he's talking about the role of the native bourgeoisie, right? And the role of the native bourgeoisie is effectively to, as Nkrumah, right, talks about, right, is to kind of keep those colonial relations intact and allow the metropole, right, the countries in the North, the former colonizers, to continue their exploitative relationships that were created under colonialism, right? But also kind of being a more local face, right, to kind of hide behind their claims of nationality, right, national belonging, their claims of community, and not actually dealing with the fact that they're perpetuating class differences, right, both domestically and internationally, if you will. So the short answer is it's, well, and I also want to move away from just the kind of colonial, the former colonizer notion as well, because I think as Mr. McConey brought up, China also plays a role in this, right? And China relies on the language of South-South solidarity, right? Formerly from like the 1955 Bandung Conference, when China was actually in concert with governments in the global South, right? That created like the Third World Alignment. And through their own kind of reliance on this expedited and rapacious capitalism, have moved up into a position where they also rely on the same types of mechanisms, right? Accumulation through dispossession that the Western countries use as well. And so I think we have to really take into consideration international classes, divisions of labor, right? And domestic divisions of labor to account for who is actually benefiting from African countries remaining in these structurally disadvantaged locations. Does that answer the question?
I would like to hand over to Desmond. He would like to expand a little bit on his question.
Sure.
Thank you, Magda, and thank you, Dr. Harper Shipman. I appreciate your comments, especially to this question, because I have to admit I haven't read your works. So some of the questions I'm asking here and trying to wrestle with here are likely reflections of that. But it was helpful to hear you talk about your thoughts on that first question about what development means. And I was asking this partly in reflection to, or in response to some other bodies of work that I've been looking at, for instance, the post-development, discourses, and even more recently, decoloniality, and the argument that development itself is a narrative, is a story we've learned to tell ourselves about the way the world works. But we've had enough reason to believe that that's just a story. It doesn't have much to do with reality. And those who control that narrative then use that for the exploitative, for continuing the exploitative traditions that I think you point into here. And I wonder, how you might explore that in the context of your own work. I'll give you a personal example. So when I started working on issues of development, I remember, my first, it was actually my dissertation research, and I was doing some work in India, in Nigeria, and in UNESCO. And a lot of my questions or interests were to understand the ways the nation state was processing, this idea of development. Mm-hmm. I always would go to government ministries and so on and so forth. But in that study, it became fairly clear to me that I might have been looking at the wrong thing. That is that, the fact that we have the nation state as an entity today is a product of coloniality. The government that represents the nation state also is not only a product, but a tool in the hands of this particular discourse to perpetuate a particular set of social conditions. And it's forced me to begin to look elsewhere. And I wonder, if there is any ways that understanding of those bodies of work, looking, from 30,000 feet above, can help reorganize the ways that, one might think about these research processes, what questions to ask, of whom, and for what purposes, right? It almost seems like a lot of the conversations we're having here is still pointing toward the idea that there is a need for development, or that there is this singular pathway toward a certain end or certain destiny of development. And I don't know that that's necessarily the case.
Yeah.
So, appreciate this.
Yes, absolutely. But I think even in my own work, right, like I argue that much, right, is that there is no singular path to development, right? In fact, that we don't need, but again, some of this relies on suggesting that development is something that can only be had through the nation state, right? And through capitalist development or through capitalist growth. Instead of reconfiguring how we imagine development as something that happened prior to that, right? And that language as well has also been co-opted, right, by the nation state and by this push for economic growth. So I guess in some respects, I'm of two minds, right? There's development that has happened before that. And when I say that, I mean what communities are doing to address their own solutions. And then the more dominant notion of development that we get, as you're saying adequately, right, through the nation state, which is certainly still just a mechanism, right, for reproducing coloniality, right, is not development, right? I think there is a way we have to take back that word, and because there's something inherently good in that, right? Like it's not to suggest that change, growth, progress, et cetera, is a problem. And by allowing donors in the state to seize upon that language, right, and to attempt to seize upon that history of it can only happen through them, right, we're also doing ourselves and our communities a disservice, right? So there is a level at which we kind of have to take back that language as well and acknowledge that what they're doing is not development, right? Again, it's a destructive, it's destroying humanity, it's destroying the earth, right? It's destroying everything that's needed to, in fact, to do development, right? But I think you're absolutely right. And I'm really glad you raised that point about the decolonial model that's saying essentially that, right? It's going back to like what Sankara was talking about, is that there's a matrix of power, right? A matrix of power that was produced through coloniality. And in order to really start the process of, at this larger scale, right, of bringing forth a new humanity, we have to deal with the multifaceted way that coloniality was implemented, right? That power was basically spread across the world, right? In general, remade the world, right? In the image of that narrative you're talking about, that false narrative of everyone trending towards development.
Thank you. The next question is from Busi, and it's coming back to your study. What was the rationale for comparing Kenya, an East African country and former British colony, to Burkina Faso, a West African country and former French colony?
Yes. So what I wanted to account for was, there was a way that the literature would always talk about the role that colonialism played, right, in the aftermath. So the types of institutions one might find because of what was left by the former colonizers, as explaining the difference in development strategies, right? Or explaining the difference in the way that these different countries came about or are existing politically, economically, et cetera. And so, again, I really wanted to kind of, not completely dispel that myth, but just kind of hold it constant, right? So that one could not say, well, what you're finding in terms of this sense of underdevelopment or this sense of dependency is just because they were former French colonies. And we know that when the French left, they took everything, including the light bulb, right? Mm-hmm. So I wanted to make sure that there was a way in which we could dispel, we could just kind of hold that constant and say, I don't have to go into the how colonialism, how who colonized whom is not a matter of why there's difference between these countries or why we see convergence, et cetera. But we've checked that and we can say that while those histories are certainly important and they impact the different types of institutions, but we still see, again, this convergence from both countries around the same exact development strategies, the same exact development tools, the same language, the same reorganization of society around this particular development goal. All of these things have converged in both countries despite their former colonizers, right? Today, they're in the same place in terms of what they're advocating they need for their development.
There is a question from Basi Antia, our colleague. Basi, how is your internet connection? Would you like to ask your own question?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Yeah, so thanks a lot for the presentation. Just thinking of some other perspective on ownership. My standpoint is around who has the power to define what a local development priority is. Now, in the area of development communication, for instance, what we have found is that when priorities are externally defined, all right, the receiving government of this aid is asked for some counterpart support for the project. Mm-hmm. And so resources that should have gone into addressing what the local government sees as its priority are now channeled to support this funding coming from elsewhere. And invariably, these projects do not succeed. So I was just wondering if in your work in Burkina Faso or in Kenya or elsewhere on the continent, you have seen imbalances introduced into the local ecology as a result of external funding.
Yes, thank you for that. So this is one example. This is a really great framing of what I'm talking about, especially in Burkina Faso, right, where the aid that's coming from donors is driving the work that the community-based organizations are doing for their own communities, right? So donors, I'll give you another example from the field. So I was witnessing a meeting between the NGOs and the NGO that was funding a lot of the community-based organizations, and they were essentially reporting on their progress from that quarter. And the NGOs had asked about Gabby Vaccination. I'm not sure if all of you have heard of Gabby Vaccination, but it's a global vaccination fund. And they had just recently, the NGOs put that on the schedule of things that the community-based organizations had to do, was to get out a certain number of vaccinations in their targeted areas. And so when they were reporting on it, none of the community-based organizations were able to do it, right? They were like, you know, the head nurse wasn't working with them, and it was very difficult to do. And the NGO, the heads of the NGO really admonished the community-based organizations, telling them, you know, this is a problem. If you all can't do this, you're going to start losing funding. You need to be accountable to the donors, right? We give you a task. Gabby Vaccination needs you to implement these different, you know, to find these children and vaccinate them, right? And to the extent that you all can't accomplish that, then you risk losing your funding, right? And so this was like a very direct and concrete example of, even though Gabby Vaccination was not in the room, they themselves were not telling the community-based organizations, you need to do this. The NGO was working on behalf of all of those donors, right? And they themselves had to go back and be accountable for what the community-based organizations were doing and whether or not they were able to kind of goad them and get them to execute the projects that they were supposed to do. Mind you, in Burkina Faso, and this part of Tinkotogo, though the vaccinations, and similar to the family planning example I gave, that wasn't what the community was saying that it needed, right? The community was actually, at that time, there were conversations around the cost of living having gone up, right? And access to food, and there had been considerable implications from drought that had been taking place, right? So food insecurity was a bigger concern, right? And directly linked to health, but that wasn't what the community-based organizations were able to tackle, right? So instead of getting food, the communities were getting vaccines and contraception, right? And so I think that's a clear example of what you're talking about, where at the local level, right, they're not dictating how they get to use those resources, right? They're not fungible to the extent that they can address what the community is telling them. It's still a very top-down model where donors in the government, according to what they've decided is important, get to dictate how that money is spent.
Thank you so much for all your answers, Dr. Harper Shipman. Now, since we do not have more questions in the chat box, I would propose to wrap up the formal session by Dr. Makoni, and then we still will have some after our party time in which we can ask informal questions without moderation. So Dr. Makoni, over to you.
Okay, I think thank you very much, Dr. Harper Shipman. This was very interesting. The question I think that kept coming up was, are they alternatives? My reading of the literature and what we are saying, the question is not whether they are alternatives or not. They are alternatives. The question is, how do we articulate those alternatives? And what stance do we adopt towards the alternatives? Because the alternatives exist, but we need some form of critical engagement with those alternatives. One of the alternatives that Dr. Harper Shipman was referring to was, to some extent, the revival of endogenous or indigenous knowledges. While I am sympathetic towards that argument, I would like to, I think Jean Komarov, in an email to me 2-3 weeks ago, captures, I think, very well my own current sentiments about an uncritical celebration of indigenous or endogenous strategies as a way forward. And she writes, there is no untouched indigeneity waiting to redeem an overheated hegemonic metropole. but there are many peripheral worlds that have distinct critical ways of being and knowing, informed by indigenous genealogies that can provide contrasting, transformative insight. Critique and innovation can come from the confrontation of the old centers with eccentric and different modes of thought and life. But emancipatory transformation can also arise from immanent critique and the contradictions within central social domains. Then she proceeds. So basically, what I'm trying to say is the alternatives are there. The issue about indigeneity or endogeneity, yes, but you need to adopt a critical engagement even with what you may regard as endogenous, so that you avoid falling into the trap of mythologizing what may come up as indigenous knowledges. So, for example, what you have in South Africa, to some extent, what you have in Ecuador, where you have a tendency to see the mythologizing either of Ubuntu or the mythologizing of Sumaka Kawasi. My argument is that that will take us in a wrong direction as well, as long as if we don't engage critically, even with what we are regarding as endogenous. And the other issue I think that kept coming up is if there are alternatives, the issue then becomes, what does decoloniality offer us? My view is that decoloniality should not only offer us alternative futures, but it should offer us both ways of talking about that future which will make it actionable. So what is required conceptually is not only a change in thinking, but a change in ways of talking about those issues that are of central significance to us. Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. So let me just say that I completely agree, especially with the uncritical thinking around indigeneity, right? And I think that's why I don't necessarily rely on, for example, post-development thinking, right? Because post-development thinking sees the alternative to development as rooted in indigeneity. And it is very unreflexive and uncritical. And what I'm thinking through, though, is not necessarily that all of the answers lie in indigeneity, right? But that there are clear examples of when people return to particular knowledges, right, in order to solve problems. I'm more of the mindset that James Ferguson puts forth in Global Shadows, where he talks about multiple modernities, right? There is no single modernity. And so what we often see, similar to what Komarov is talking about, is this kind of, is a way in which, yes, indigeneity is not untouched, right? But there are ways in which people merge their own needs. That's part of what I think development is, right? Is in finding solutions to the community. Maybe one solution is that you return to this knowledge source to deal with agriculture, but you also get toilets, right? And so I don't think that there's any kind of pure model for what that looks like. It really is about the community, in my opinion. The other thing I want to bring up is I often, and this might be unpopular, but I often am critical of the way that academics think that things have to be legible to us in order for it to be important, or in order for it to be made accessible to other people, right? So I think that there are times or examples of development happening, right, whether indigenous or through an alternate modernity, that perhaps is best left untouched by the academy, because we also are complicit in a type of industrial knowledge production, right, where we seize upon things in order to and bring them into this kind of this extractive notion of knowledge, right, where it's what we're finding is not necessarily about just understanding that thing or that phenomenon for itself, but how can we bring this into the academy and make it legible for other people, right? And then there are ways in which sometimes that thing then has to be further protected from the academy, right? I think we can look at, for example, the Zapatistas. Once word got out about the Zapatista movement, you know, they couldn't control, or not couldn't control, but there was a kind of influx of interest in Zapatistas as the example for autonomous movements against the state, et cetera. And so sometimes I'm also thinking about whether or not everything I see as an example needs to come into the research, or that I need to excavate that and make that legible to everybody in the academy, right? But again, that's something I'm also just kind of working through, right? It's like, does everything need to be legible to academics in order for it to be important?
Yeah, that's interesting, because you say in some of your work, you talk about extractivism, and although you were referring, I think, to development, you could easily apply the same concept to academy, that there are times when academy comes across as extractivist. It's more or less like it is mimicking the way the mining industry operates, for example.
Absolutely. That's absolutely right. And so I also think that, you know, a lot of communities also sometimes need to be protected from academics, right? Academics don't always go into these spaces with the best intentions, or with, you know, clear research ethics, right? So, you know, when we start talking about like, well, how do we make sense of these indigeneity, or how do we find examples? And is that it's sometimes those communities are better left untouched by both the development industry and the academic industry.
Yes. Yeah, but my view, I think, if you ask me, is that the challenge about indigeneity is that I'm more likely to think of indigeneity as being invented by post-colonial academics to try and make sense of pre-colonial Africa. So that there's nothing endogenous about indigeneity, but that's a story for a long day, for another day. Basically, what I'll be doing there is to try and resist the idea that indigeneity gives you a sense of what Africa was like before the encounter with colonial rule, by arguing that the indigeneity that we're talking about here is simply a distillation of by academics of what they think Africa looked like, right? That it is an artificial construction of the past, and that we can really go back to that past, but try as much as we want.
Yes. Now, if I can say, because this makes me think of like the really important work that Jane Gordon does, right, around creolization, and thinking about how we can in fact move from thinking about indigeneity as these pure untouched sources, pre-colonial models, but thinking about culture, right, as these points of contact, right? Thinking about how these spaces really are examples of the way that communities have navigated those points of contact, right? And so they just manifest themselves differently, right, through different kind of regimes of knowledge and different kind of negotiations of knowledge, right, technology, et cetera. And so I completely agree with you. And even when I talk about going back to the past, I'm not talking about going to, again, this nostalgic form of some untouched pre-colonial system that was not violent, because we know even in pre-colonial Africa, there was violence, right? There were, you know, there were all of these things that we don't want to carry forward. But there's a way that the development industry and even academia has this collective amnesia, right, about what's taking place. And so we also have to actively work against that, I think, by returning to the past to remember how we got to where we got to today as well.
You see, it was connected to that. For example, next week, Mahmoud Mamdani will be talking about his book, Neither Settler Nor Native, and I'm sure he will touch to some extent on these discussions about indigeneity, how settlers and how natives are constructed as ideas and as political entities within Africa and the United States. Yeah, good. That's fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you all for these really great questions.
Yeah.
Thank you so much again. So with that, I will officially close this part of our meeting. So I will stop recording and I will hand over to my colleague Vishnya.
Thank you so much again, Dr. Harper Shipman. You've given us a lot